Hello, everyone. Welcome into this Zoom space. I see some of our attendees have attended earlier events today, so thank you for sticking with us throughout this, what is actually our last full day of Montana Book Festival events for 2021. We'll have some one-off events here and there in the coming weeks, but this is our last concentrated day of this year's festival. So thank you again for sticking with us. This is a Montana Book Festival event, and this particular event is featuring biographers Liz Brown and Alan Waltzian. This is A Stranger Here in My Own Land, Forgotten Stories of Queer Love and Legacy in the West. I'm so excited about this conversation. This event is sponsored by a number of different organizations and businesses in Montana, including Arts Missoula, MissoulaEvents.net, the Whitefish Review, Humanities Montana, and the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation. An enormous thank you to our supporters and our sponsors. We couldn't do this without you. My name is Lauren Korn. I am the director of the Montana Book Festival. I am zooming in, as I have been, from my office in the Mountain Press Publishing Company building in Missoula, Montana. The Montana Book Festival acknowledges that we are in the Aboriginal territories of the Salish and Kalispel people. The name Missoula comes from the Bitterroot Salish word in Misuletko, which means place of freezing water. The name has been used for over 12,000 years since the existence of glacial Lake Missoula. The first Europeans who came here borrowed the Salish term in Misuletko and modified the word to Missoula. Later, when glacial Lake Missoula melted, the Bitterroot Salish began using an additional term for Missoula, which means place of the small bull trout. In 1855, the Bitterroot Salish were forced to sign the Hellgate Treaty, and following this treaty, the United States government carried out forced assimilation, removal, and genocide against the Salish people in their efforts to acquire land. Yet despite centuries of colonial theft and oppression, the Tutiacan people are still here and thriving on their Aboriginal lands. The Montana Book Festival strives, and we will continue to strive, to help promote Indigenous voices as one of the ways our organization acknowledges and respects the Aboriginal peoples of Missoula. For those of you zooming in from outside of Missoula, and I think there are some of you, especially our panelists today, I encourage you to let us know where you're zooming in from. Sarah Capdeville, a Montana Book Festival volunteer who's working on the back end of things with me today, is going to throw a link in the chat that can help you identify which territories you are currently occupying. So if you'd like, let us know where you're zooming in from today. A few logistics before I hand things over. Thank you for this, bearing with me through this long introduction, but just some housekeeping. I'd like to invite you as attendees to throw your questions specifically into the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen. They will be addressed towards the end of the conversation, the last 10 minutes or so. Feel free to use this other function, the chat function. Sarah is going to be throwing out some book links where you can purchase Liz and Alan's books today, and we can engage with each other in that space. But if you have specific questions for Liz or Alan, please put them in the Q&A specifically so they can see them there and they're easily organized. And then before I turn things over, I want to note that if you're interested in purchasing Liz's book, Twilight Man, or Alan's book, Savage West, you can do so through our festival bookseller, Fact and Fiction Books here in Missoula, Montana. You can go into the brick and mortar storefront, or you can purchase online at factandfictionbooks.com. Any sales or any books that you buy at Fact and Fiction, please be sure to enter MBF at checkout. That ensures that 20% of those sales come back to the festival so that we can continue programming like this. So with all of that out of the way, I'd love to introduce our authors, our biographers today. Liz Brown has written for Book Forum, Elle Decor, London Review of Books, Los Angeles Times, New York Times Book Review, and other publication. She lives in Los Angeles. Like I said earlier, she is the author of Twilight Man. Welcome, Liz Brown.
Thank you.
And Alan Waltzian is an author and specialist in American and Western American literatures. He worked 40 years as a full-time academic, 29 of which were at the University of Montana Western in Dillon, Montana. He has published dozens of articles, 2 chapbooks, and 9 books, including studies or collections of writers Rick Bass, John McPhee, and Norman MacLean. He lives in Montana. He is the author of one of the featured books today, Savage West. Welcome, Alan.
Thank you, Lauren.
Yeah, I'm going to turn things over to you. Okay. Thanks so much.
All right, we're going to jump into this. Alan, I think you're on mute. I think you're muted, Alan. Ah,
Good now?
now,
Sorry.
there you are, coming in loud and clear.
Good.
All right, so
Yeah.
for people following along, we were just talking before, and we thought we'd begin with a definition of the phrase Twilight Man, which is the name of this book. And I came across it in a biography of the Clarks of Montana, a sensationalist kind of tell-all written in the 40s. And in it, it referred to the secret young male lover of William Andrews Clark Jr. as the type known as Twilight Men. And this was a term I'd never heard before, but apparently it was a very common, not a very common, but briefly it was a term for gay men in the 1930s and 1920s. And in plunging into this story, from the beginning, I knew I wanted to name the book Twilight Man, simply because it is sort of resurrecting a lost term, as the book is kind of reclaiming a lost person. And there is so much about this man's life that exists in the Twilight. I'll tell you a little bit, and then I'll hand it over to Alan to talk about Savage West. Harrison Post, who is the subject of Twilight Man, was a Jewish shop clerk in the 19-teens when a wealthy philanthropist named William Andrews Clark Jr. walked into the luxury boutique where Harrison worked in San Francisco, and an affair soon followed, and Harrison soon followed Clark down to LA, where William Andrews Clark Jr. was in the midst of launching the LA Philharmonic, pouring his vast wealth into the culture of early LA. So all this is happening in California, but of course, as many people probably know, Clark's money came from Montana. He was the son of William Andrews Clark Sr., who was one of the early industrialists, early robber barons of Montana. And Twilight Man is really, in a way, is many things, but one of the things it is a story about this young shop clerk's reinvention through his collision with that wealth, and eventually his destruction by his collision with that wealth. Sort of starts out like a fairy tale, landing in this wealthy kingdom, and then turns into something very dark and noir. And I'll stop there and hand it off to Alan.
Okay, thank you for that, Liz. So if you guys haven't heard of Thomas Savage, that in effect is the one explanation for my writing the biography of a novelist I consider to be one of the best from Montana without any question, a giant in 20th century novel, particularly for fiction from the Intermountain West. And why isn't he known like a Norman MacLean is, or a Rick Bass, for example? That's what has bothered me and energized my writing about this guy for years and years. And before I was told a long time ago that I should write about this guy from the town I've lived in for 30 years, Dillon, in the southwest corner of Montana. And I never even heard of him myself until 25 years ago or 20 years ago. And then I started teaching him, interviewing family people. I missed actually meeting him. Tom Savage was born in 1915, died in 2003 in Virginia. A big, huge career, 14 novels, and whatever happened to him? Well, partly of what happened to him is that his novels, his fiction earned consistently rave reviews, and he sold terribly. Even his best novel, which is called The Power of the Dog, which is now a major motion picture, which I'd like to talk about with you a little bit later, even that supposedly sold only 1,000 copies or so when it first came out in 1967. And my book is an act of literary recovery. I'm trying to get this guy back to the position I think he so richly deserves. I think part of the reason for his obscurity is his own very complex gender life. Because I was sharing with Liz, I think in some respects, Savage was a Twilight Man. He was a gay writer who ends up, as so many gay men did for generations, masking his sexual identity through heterosexual conduct. And in Savage's case, he was in fact happily married. And it gets, in his story, more complicated because his wife was also a novelist and understood him when they were courting to be, by his own admission, gay. And things fell apart by the early 1960s when Savage left his family, wife and 3 children, and took off with a young lover for about a year and a half, who subsequently became a very famous children's book author much later. Savage tried to live it both ways, dropped his lover, returned maybe reluctantly, maybe more complicated than just reluctantly, to his heterosexual life, to his family. And I think that this tension that was never not in him drove his career and precipitated his best fiction, which is 1967 with The Power of the Dog, and then a bunch of novels fairly soon after that. So he had a real complicated story. And I would just add right now this comment, that before he wrote The Power of the Dog, he wrote an overtly gay novel about he and his lover. And his literary agent, with whom he stayed his entire career in New York City, told him in approximately 1964 that this would never sell. She couldn't sell it to Little Brown, who published most of the Savage's novels. It wouldn't go. So what does this guy do? He throws the manuscript into the Atlantic, and there are no copies. He said twice in his life later, once in writing and once in an interview, that he only wrote truly about himself once. Connect the dots. So why is it, we've been wondering, even as late as the middle of the last century, and in the case of Harrison Post and Will Clark, or in the case of Tom Savage and his lover, earlier or later than the middle of the last century, why is the code of silence and the life of disguise urgent and absolutely necessary? I mean, you want to take a stab at that, Liz? Or
well, I mean, in Harrison's case, and I think even would it have been true for Tom Savage? I mean, it was simply criminal to be gay. So there is that just basic element. And that was something that not surprised me, but I guess was, in doing the research for this book, really drove home how gay men were targeted and were, prey for people to blackmail and extort. And so that was a big part of what was happening with Will and Harrison, and especially because they had so much money, they were especially large targets.
I know that comment that Liz just made me think of a book I'd read a long time ago that helped me get ready to write about Tom Savage, and that's a book called Farm Boys. And I don't remember what comes after the colon, but that's a study from a generation ago, almost a sociological study of what happens to gay men, in this case from the Northern Rockies. I mean, rural spaces, rural locations such as where I live. If you're not in Los Angeles, what happens to you? And, part of his argument is that mostly they left.
Yeah.
And even in my town, as recently as one generation ago, if you were gay or lesbian, it was a tough sell. And it was not something to be brooded about very well. It was not easy to be outed. It just wasn't. And I think with this novelist, this also fueled the way that he wrote about where he's from, the rural Intermountain West, and he was a hard ass.
Yeah.
It's Savage's West, kind of possessive, but it's also kind of an excoriating version of the place where he's from. It's too easy to say that a talented and creative person like this, or like a Will Clark, would just leave and hide somewhere else. In the case of a novelist, at least, or an artist like a Savage, they never leave. I mean, they physically leave, but I try to argue that they own a place, and it's not enough to say that they hate the place they're from. It's always more complicated.
Yeah, who I thought of while reading Savage West was James Joyce, someone who we think of as one of the quintessential Irish writers, but most of that writing he was doing was on the European continent, and he don't think after he left he ever went back. And and I feel like that aspect of exile runs deep through Tom Savage and his work, that he's living in Maine for decades, or maybe on the West Coast for a portion of time, but his subject is Montana, and nothing else.
And in a way, he, with a guy like this, he's trying to probe and anatomize, and maybe in some ways eviscerate the ranching dynasty story, which is heterosexual. I mean, that's one of the main things, because it could be argued that, or I try to make the case that ranches represent the the rural version of being a Clark dynasty.
Yeah,
this is kind of the top, and Savage says this F's people up. It destroys people. It does not elevate them to a privileged position up towards which everyone else fondly gazes. It does just the opposite. It kills families.
Yeah, I was really struck by that, the sort of his very dark view of ranching dynasties. It's obvious, when you look at mining, it is very easy to see the destructive force of mining, right? It's literally ruining the land. But it was interesting to turn that same criticism, or a similar criticism, onto ranching. And I don't know that I have not yet. I picked up, I heard my sister speak my name. That I picked up a copy of that.
Oh, thank you. Good.
At the Strand book a few weeks ago. And I'm excited to read The Power of the Dog, but I don't know that I've seen that quite something that goes at ranching, which is interesting to me, coming from Northern California, which is surrounded by rice fields and ranchers. And why is the ranching dynasty corrosive?
Well, it doesn't lend itself very easily to multi-generational succession when the very act of passing on a ranch becomes immediately financially, emotionally fraught if there is more than one son. If you happen to be a daughter until a relatively recently, that's an end game right there. Whether one argues that as a basic sexism or something else, but two of the best writers, two of the best narratives happen to be written by women in Montana a generation ago, are All But the Waltz by my friend Mary Clearman Blue, who is a great novelist writer, or Breaking Clean by Judy Blunt. And they both tell the story of being a daughter or daughter-in-law of a ranch and having to get the hell out of there because there's absolutely no option for them. There's no space whatsoever in this assumed heterosexual norm. This particular culture, there's no space whatsoever. And Savage, I think, in his fiction and quite a few of his books, he argues that there's really that people are placed into these horrific narrow boxes, and that there becomes no elbow room. There's no sort of space for other types of men or women, men who might be masculine, or men who might be effeminate. That's still remaining, at least to me, a pretty thoroughly pejorative word. Or conversely, and more complicatedly maybe, women being tomboys or being tagged as mannish or macho or such other stuff as that. The spectrum of the gender spectrum, I'm trying to say, is pretty attenuated, at least traditionally, it could be argued, in ranch culture. And certainly anyone who aspires, who seems to be different, or who has artistic aspiration of one sort or another, might have a tough go in a Dylan.
Yeah.
And that argument, by the way, can
Yeah.
still maybe
Yeah.
I hope it's just historical, please.
One thing you said just prompted a thought, which is, I think what's interesting is, or what's a distinction definitely in the figures in our books, is that I think Thomas Savage had a very clear gimlet eye on all of this. And I think the people in the book that in Twilight Man, especially Will Clark Jr., scion of this dynasty, I don't think they see themselves, understand how they in a way are being destroyed by their own wealth. And that was something that surprised me. I thought I was going to rescue this gay love story, and that's a little bit of what's in there, but in the end, I felt like I was really following a story about the absolute corrosiveness of extreme wealth.
Yeah.
And just through a gay lens, in a way, like here's what happened to queer lives that intersected with this phenomenal fortune.
And in at least early 20th century ranch culture in the Northern Rockies, that notion of extreme wealth translates itself into land, and it becomes just a quantity game, as in who owns the most. In Tom Savage's career, folks, I make the argument that in the arc of his fiction, he sets up his version of the American West in the first two novels, and the second, which are both reprinted now. The second novel is titled Lona Hansen, and this came out in 1948. And the protagonist, who is fundamentally confused about her gender identity. She's a woman, and yet she's cast in masculinist colors, and she's destroyed by the legacy of the 20,000 acres. She isolates herself from all of her family members. She's blackmailed by a corrupt ranch foreman, who is the first draft of the, if you will forgive me, the most badass and most famous single character Savage wrote. Lona ends entirely alone because she's enslaved by the 20,000 acres. I make the comment, if you guys remember Jane Smiley's 1,000 acres from 1991 in Iowa, that Savage's second novel is a Montana version of 1,000 acres without the King Lear plot context. And it's only about self-destruction.
It's interesting what you say about land. I mean, I think about this so much in terms of climate catastrophe and other things. Just the Western frontier's obsession with owning land, as if in a way that's possible, as opposed to the stewardship of land.
Right.
And this idea of passing, that itself just feels like folly, that we're passing this land on as if, I don't know, as if it's not going to change. I mean, I thought a lot about that when I was researching mining, just in learning the mining process and just how
Yeah.
much geology moves our
Mhm.
borders and our terrain.
Mhm.
And it just feels like at the root of Western expansion and frontier thinking, and is just this ultimate folly. I just wanted to say, I see there are questions in the Q&A, and we had decided we were going to ask each other a few questions and then toward the end shift over. So I didn't want anyone who puts their questions in to think they're being ignored. Please put them in, and we will get to them in a little bit.
Would you say, Liz, that a Will Clark, born in the particular circumstances he is, and ostensibly bisexual, or maybe you would define him differently than that, do you think he had a chance, in light of your comment about the tale of absolute greed, and which inevitably leads to absolute corruption?
Did he have a chance? That's a really good question. I don't know. I feel like he sort of he attempted to follow his father's footsteps, which involved essentially grooming a young girl who would become his second wife. This is Clark Sr., the senator. And it seems like Will Clark may have been doing something similar with, in a way, I think he may have done something with Harrison. Harrison was 20 years younger and was in his 20s when they met. He was all consensual, but it starts to seem that Will Clark repeats that pattern as the decades go on with other younger men and boys. And that sort of, I don't think he ever was able to get out of that Clark mentality that people are commodities, that you can kind of own them, even if there's a benevolent idea behind it. I wonder though, in his desire, I'm just thinking about how much he wanted to be a violinist. And that in a way the LA Phil, you could argue that it's like the result of his own wish to be a musician, that he wasn't talented enough, or the life of an artist really wasn't available to him given his social status. So the next best thing is just to create a massive orchestra. And I don't know, maybe if he had been allowed to kind of live the life of keep studying the violin in Paris, as he'd been doing. Maybe I don't know. I think it's possible Huguette Clark, if people aren't familiar, was Will Clark's half sister, who was a reclusive heiress who died about 10 years ago, and kind of brought the Clark name into the rest of the country, which I know Montana people are very well aware of the Clarks, but the rest of the country seemed to have forgotten them until Huguette's death. And she was the artist in the family. She painted, she built doll houses, which get somewhat mocked, but in a way, I kind of think maybe as a woman, this is maybe one of the saving graces of being a woman, was if you're ignored enough, you and you have enough money, you just do what you want. So, I don't know, maybe she's the Clark who got lucky in that way.
To say a couple of other things about Tom Savage, I think the tragedy, if so far as there was tragedy in his case, in his life, is that is a failed recognition all through his lifetime, frankly, about most of his career, most of his work. He had a very good idea of how good he was, I think, as a novelist. I think because of ranch sales, they were never lacking for money. They certainly had he and his wife were both alcoholics. That's where the tragedy gets more personal. There were two sons and a daughter. One, the oldest son, has been dead for 20 years. alcoholism and schizophrenia run in the family down through the present generation. I spent had a dinner finally and visited face to face with this author, this novelist's remaining son, and got a sobering update about what that whole family has been like. So although these two apparently had this husband-wife, both novelists, had this childlike interdependency, and Betty Savage, who wrote 9 novels, published 9 novels in 20 years, most of which I think are quite good. She would be the first to say, however, that she never thought her fictions were up to her husband's. And I think Tom just had more, frankly, weight and more bite, and maybe even more wit. But in personal terms, his family life was pretty tragic. In terms of reputation, he was barely on the screen. And I speak early on about his under or non-recognition in his native state during his lifetime and for a decade following his death in 2003. And my some earlier publications, and I hope this bio, or as I mentioned earlier, trying to get him back. If you'll forget, if it's okay, Liz, I'd like to say a couple things about The Power of the Dog,
yes.
Because no less than internationally acclaimed movie director Jane Campion decided some years ago to make a movie about The Power of the Dog. And after COVID delays, the movie is out now and making the rounds of a series of film festivals, American and international, European and Canadian, and will be available on Netflix after December. Netflix backed the movie. It stars Benedict Cumberbatch and Kristen Dunst, and apparently Cumberbatch might well be nominated for an Oscar award. He plays Phil Burbank, who is this character I made reference to a few minutes ago. He's the most badass in all of Savage's fiction, and the most tragic example of what it might feel like to be a gay rancher and survive somehow in the North US of a century ago. He is a misogynistic, misanthropic, hateful, self-hating, homophobic, gay rancher. That's our guy.
As I was reading your descriptions of Phil Burbank in the biography, I was struck by this marker of self-loathing and for a lot of gay people, and it's almost as if you try to preempt society's hatred of you, and sort of like as if the way you're trying to outdo society and get the jump on them and show that you can hate yourself more than society can even fathom hating.
And it seems as though, I mean, you might be able to tell us how Harrison Post handled that or not. With Savage, he did what, as I mentioned earlier, what a lot of gay men did, and that was marry, in his case, happily, even though it wasn't entirely happily at all.
Right.
The marriage was often a mess, an alcoholic and otherwise mess, and there is this undercurrent all through most of his novels. There's a gay conversation, explicit or implicit, which is calling into question, and more than calling into question, the fate of sexual minorities in small towns, whether those actually are in New England, and the few novels that Tom set away from his home ground. Most of his fiction is in Southwest Montana, and it's set in Dillon. And if you watch the Jane Campion movie, it's all in this fancy ranch house that's a hell of a long ways from anywhere, and there's simply no space. Cumberbatch does a scary job bringing Phil Burbank to life, and I would say to all of you, I am full of joy about this movie adaptation, which could not be truer to this extraordinary novel. Let me read, if I may, just the first paragraph of The Power of the Dog, which is really short and really famous. And I'd love to. This is not comfortable for guys, this paragraph. Phil always did the castrating. First, he sliced off the cup of the scrotum and tossed it aside. Next, he forced down first one and then the other testicle, slit the rainbow membrane that enclosed it, tore it out, and tossed it into the fire where the branding irons glowed. There was surprisingly little blood. In a few moments, the testicles exploded like huge popcorn. Some men, it was said, ate them with a little salt and pepper. Mountain oysters, Phil called them with that sly grin of his, and suggested to young ranch hands that if they were fooling around with the girls, they'd do well to eat them themselves. That I try to argue that this ends up becoming a kind of a complex self-emasculation that's announced at the beginning of this extraordinary novel, and the end of the novel, which I will say nothing about, just leaves me out of breath. It's just scary. And this isn't the only novel that's just taut and just crackling with sexual tensions.
I mean, it really does seem he is long overdue to be rediscovered or discovered, if that is, given that he doesn't seem in his own lifetime he was given his due. But I mean, that's an incredible, terrifying passage.
May I ask you a question about Harrison Post now?
Yes.
So maybe you could tell us, Harrison Post's life is so tragic in some ways. He enjoyed wealth and became an art connoisseur and knew more about book making than I can imagine. And yet he only lives to age 49, and he lives under Twilight, and he enacts this code life and everything else. How much do you think Harrison Post would have a better chance by now? Would it be completely different for him, or just partially so, or what?
Well, I think it would be very different. I do think it'd be very different. But he had a chance at the end of his life. And I think I still think his dependency on the Clark empire and his expectation that it was always going to be there to keep him afloat is actually the thing that took him down. And that at the end of his life, he has a moment where he's offered a job at that same company where he first met Will Clark. He's pretty much destitute, and keeps trying to reclaim his story. For those who haven't read the book, his fortune was essentially stolen from him by his predatory blackmailing sister. And
it's so demonic. It's like, Liz, it's like the worst demonic story in Charles Dickens or something. It's just too horrible to be true, except you know it's true.
It's pretty diabolical. Yeah. And he, at the end of his life, he's trying to recover this fortune, and he's trying to use legal measures, extra legal measures, to put pressure on his sister to get some kind of settlement. And at the same time, he's been offered a job in the same company that he had worked for when he first met Will.
Right.
But at this point, 20 years have passed, 30 years have passed since he worked. And he's been so kind of enfeebled by being dependent by this kind of aristocracy he stepped into, that he can't take it upon himself to step out. And this is in San Francisco after World War II. He's meeting gay men, one of whom is a friend who works as a window designer in the city of Paris department store, who there are ways you sort of see as he comes back from the war and is re-entering life in San Francisco. You see the beginnings of this gay world that's possible. And even though, of course, it's still criminal or illegal to be gay, you see men living and forming relationships and finding each other.
Yes.
And he could have, I feel like if he had never entered the Clark world, that would have been his life. He could have lived a long life in that way.
I would, maybe there's a segue here. I would say that with Tom Savage's life, it ends up in disappointment or more by the 1980s, after there has been a generation, an explosion, a literary explosion that is, of gay and lesbian writers, where things are very much in the public. Writers like Patricia Nell Warren, also originally from Montana, whose novels The Front Runner, for example, changes the landscape in 1974. But Tom missed that boat, and at the end of the 1980s and at the beginning of the 1990s, and he's been in the writing game for half a century by now, he is not even able to sell this novella that he's working on called Buddies. And Buddies is a same-sex love story set in World War I. And it goes nowhere. And I have in my possession most of the extant manuscript of that. And what's but by the 1990s, folks, in higher ed where I used to live, this thing called queer theory has now become one of the most important elements of literary criticism of new ways of understanding texts, some of which had never been properly understood, taught, written about, talked about, celebrated, blah, blah, blah. So what happened with Savage? Well, Savage knew in the 1988 interview that he was writing really for a coterie audience. And now I'm going to read the short opening paragraph of The Sheep Queen, which is the republished title of I Heard My Sister Call My Name, which is arguably the most overtly autobiographical novel he wrote. You get a flavor of that right from here. And this paragraph has stuck like a burr in my head for a long, long time. So I will call myself Tom Burton, or Thomas Burton, as the name would appear on the novels I write. I am too difficult for some readers, and my sentences are sometimes more than statements. Many readers are comfortable only with simple sentences and prefer books that reward a belief in the happy ending and the pot at the end of the rainbow, even as the rainbow retreats and those who follow are footsore. There is no ending, happy or otherwise, only a pause. And that is a literary declaration of independence. I think it's also a third finger stuck up in the air towards all kinds of not only formula Westerns, but any popular cultural literary production about the American West. Tom Savage is saying, fuck you to all that. And if you're interested in a much tougher and truer American West, then you might give me a shot.
Yeah. I think that's kind of a perfect segue to go to some of the questions, just so we make sure we, because there's a lot of good stuff. Shall I just read some and then read one and then we respond?
Yeah.
The first one says, these histories are so colorful and so meticulously presented. What were your research processes like, and how did you decide which threads to pull on, which to illuminate? Do you want to start?
I mentioned earlier, I'd been told by one of my wise elders, you really should check out this Tom Savage. And I started doing it, and there's I found one article published about this guy, which is some measure of obscurity. And then I was lucky enough to get to know his nephew, to whom I've dedicated the biography, actually, and he shared a lot and gave me contacts with other relatives, which I followed up on. a few, one at least of whom is deceased while the book was in production. And then I did a fair amount of original research in the Lemhi County Historical Library, Museum and Library in Lemhi County, Idaho, just across the border and over the Continental Divide west from my giant county in southwest Montana. Savage's maternal grandmother had quite a reputation, at least in Idaho herself. She's known as the Sheep Queen, and therefore the retitling of one of Savage's other best novels honors her and honors her role in her formative role in him, as a matter of fact. And so it was mostly primary research, primary sources, interviewing people, gathering lots and lots of records, and then getting to know his daughter, who is the literary executor, at least over the phone, and later getting to know the younger and surviving son, who would have been so candid and generous with me. This book wouldn't have made it without them, because they took me way inside. And then one other thing I'd add, I got some audio tapes of Tom Savage from 1983, the last time he enacted the local young man makes good, his celebratory return to the hometown that, remember, he mostly hates, but not entirely. And this guy was endlessly performative. He was chameleonic. He could turn on whichever he needed to, and he knew how to entertain acutely well. He was affable, genial, all those kinds of things. And so I've got a whole file from that. And for me, it was an enormous turn on and a way of getting, if you will, further inside his head to actually think about his voice as I was transcribing all those. What about you, Liz?
Well, I should say, I mean, I came to this in a very personal way because my grandmother was the niece of William Andrews Clark Jr. by marriage. And so I'd heard of this Uncle Will for years, but hadn't really paid attention until I came out and told my parents I was gay, and there was a period of exile and sort of estrangement that followed. And that really, simultaneously, I discovered this photograph of Harrison Post in my grandmother's dresser, but she had died, and no one seemed to know who he was. And I was simultaneously researching Will Clark, kind of curious about who this gay ancestor was, because I was looking to find sort of some queer lineage in the family, since I felt so kind of alienated. And that was the beginning. I ended up finding Harrison, a woman who had Harrison's journals, the Clark Library here in LA, which Will founded in the 1920s, was extremely helpful.
Yeah.
And another big breakthrough was the discovering, because at one point Harrison was declared incompetent and his sister was kind of taking over everything. And that legal file, which is several inches thick, was incredibly useful for putting all this together. In terms of like trying to figure out what threads to illuminate, and this might, there's another question right below that asks, how much putting the pieces together did you have to do, how much was investigation, and this kind of speaks to that. I would say it was a few years of investigation. I went to Norway, where Harrison had ended up during the war, bizarrely, and kind of retraced his steps there. I spent a lot of time in the LA Hall of Records. And then at a certain point, the shaping of it, shaping all that information was challenging, just because they were gay and they left no personal correspondence, even though Will had Harrison painted on the ceiling of the Clark Library. And they left lots of visual cues, but very little written.
Would you mind mentioning the visual cue and the ceiling in the library? Or
Yeah, so in this, on the ceiling of the Clark Library, if anyone is in LA, I highly recommend making a visit to it. It's an extraordinary kind of hidden gem. And when you walk into the main hallway, the foyer, and you look up, there are 13 male nudes in a kind of Michelangelo-esque styling. And this was one of the most amazing moments when I first went to the Clark Library and was asking if anyone knew about Harrison Post, and the librarian pointed to the ceiling and she said, they all have different bodies, but they all have Harrison's face.
Yeah.
So they left their traces how they could. And yeah, I sort of was like, the beginning was a bit of the book is a bit of a gay love story, but in a way, I think it is more a story of the collision with wealth, which I guess I'm repeating myself a little bit, but.
The illustration provide. The question about what do we hope these stories provide for readership. I've been thinking about that one because I like it so much. I would argue that a lot of Savage's fiction is a protest to open more gender space and more space in rural America for sexual minorities, particularly for more space in the, and I'm being hyperbolic now, in the tyrannical caste of ranch dynasty cultures. And so far as I understand those, and I don't understand them particularly well, let's say, I'm heterosexual, I'm from a suburb, from another state originally, so there's arguably a lot I don't get. I used to tell students they could figure out in half a minute what kind of hunter I am, because I wasn't very good for very many years for just going back to hiking and climbing and stuff like that. But it's really a protest, and it's in a tradition maybe like that of Sinclair Lewis, whom I see as a literary role model and forebearer for Savage. And if you guys remember anything about Sinclair Lewis, you know, he was pretty damned harsh about what small town life could do to people, whether that's in what he called Gopher Prairie, Minnesota, and Main Street, or somewhere else. And I think a lot of writers are inherently critical, and they're trying to reimagine for us a better way to go than what exists. Liz?
I guess I wanted to kind of restore this lost man. I felt even he'd been wrongfully erased, and I wanted to put him back into history, and I kept encountering him in very uncanny ways, and so it felt a little mystical to kind of tell his story. And the legacy of the Clark family is so dark, I think, that I wanted to kind of shed light on that, or in a way maybe sort of shed light on the people who were collateral damage, even generations later. And so I guess that was something that was a motivation.
This may be way too cutesy, a paraphrase of the famous Lord Acton line from British history. Wealth corrupts, absolute wealth corrupts absolutely.
Yeah, it's too true, sadly too true. There's a question here about the frontier. Talk about land in the frontier. What did the Western settings of these narratives allow or provide these people stories that a different place may not have? Interesting.
Yeah. Savage, I think probably called himself a novelist from Montana, although he immediately would add that he wasn't sure that anyone else who was a novelist in our big old rural state was aware of the fact that he was a native son writing very good fiction for the most part. He wrote what he knew, like, pardon me for just repeating a cliche, but he comes from this very unusual place. And then you know, in the beginning of this biography, I try to say to most of us live in Los Angeles. We don't live in a Dillon, Montana, that's for damn sure. And I think those of us who are of or in suburbs or cities perhaps understand less and less about that now minority for whom life is rural. And what does that feel like? And what does that feel like if you're gay?
Yeah.
If you live in if you live 45 miles out from a county seat town, which to this day, my town, about 4,000, it's the largest town in a 60-mile radius. What does that feel like? What does that mean to come from a place this remote? And so someone like Savage is trying to bring this strange topography or this strange human geography to life for those of us who live in New York or Los Angeles or anywhere else for that matter.
Yeah.
That's part of the way I would answer that.
Yeah.
What about you?
I think for the Western settings, I mean, on one point is just simply the West, the land gave the Clarks the means to amass this fortune. So it was essential to that. The other is that I think the period that I'm writing about in California is, you know, very early LA, kind of creating itself. And I think the West is just built with such a boomtown mentality and such a sense of, you know, this kind of, I can always reinvent myself again. I can always strike it. I can strike it rich. You don't go to New York to strike it rich. You go to the West to strike it rich. And I think that kind of speculative energy and ambition is definitely at the core of the book in a way. So I would say that was
I would like to add to what Liz is saying to make sure you guys get a hold of Twilight Man and start reading it quickly. For whatever reasons, have been quite interested off and on in Hollywood history. And I love fiction about Hollywood. I love The Last Tycoon of Fitzgerald. And I often thought in Twilight Man of Nathaniel West's The Day of the Locust, which Alfred Kazin 2 generations ago pronounced the best novel ever about Hollywood, the best written. And Twilight Man really catches Hollywood in the 1920s and this weird fantasy factory, wonderful, impossible city called Los Angeles that a lot of you perhaps know a lot more about than I do. But it's Los Angeles just remains so improbable and bizarre. And there are connections for you to enjoy, folks, between Twilight Man and let's say the literary journalism of Mike Davis, his 2 or 3 great books about LA, City of Quartz and Ecology of Fear, which is a real kick-ass book to me.
That is so
Los Angeles is so improbable. And by the way, Liz, one of the other really cool gay writers from Montana was a novelist named Myron Brennig, who is Jewish and who ended up in Los Angeles from Butte, Montana, and wrote a novel called The Flutter of an Eyelid, 1934, which is kind of a precursor to Nathaniel West, The Day of the Locust, 5 years later. And at the end of this novel, you guys, he creates a big enough earthquake that Los Angeles, 1934, simply slides into the Pacific. End of story.
That is on my list.
Okay.
So someone asked, what are we working on now? What are you working on now, Alan?
Oh gosh, I'm a poet and an essayist, and that's how I make all my money from my books. That's a laugh cue, by the way. So I'm trying to organize another poetry collection, and I actually haven't written too much new in the last 6 months. I'm on the corner of a room watching The Power of the Dog and watching Jane Campion's movie bring My Guy back. Good. Because it is such an impressive and honoring movie adaptation. And because Jane Campion is as an extraordinary and as famous a director as she's been since The Piano in 1993, at least. She calls this, you guys, she calls The Power of the Dog. She kept the exact same name, and she wrote the screenplay herself in the summer of 2019. She calls this movie her masculinist landscape film, which bookends her career, the piano being from 28 years ago, her feminist landscape film. So part of what I'm doing is just grinning and raising my glass of whiskey to Tom, looking down and grinning his head off and rubbing his hands with some glee, realizing that he's finally getting his due. At least I hope this is what's going to happen. What are you working on, Liz?
I'm working on a screenplay that is contemporary. It's a female buddy movie, and I'm working on some essays that are related to the book. To sort of things that there wasn't enough space in the things that had to be cut, or things to kind of tease out a little bit.
Okay, I want to read those essays.
Yeah, those are on the way, hopefully. Okay. Someone is asking about my connection to the Clark family as a great grandniece, and how the perception of my family has changed, my place in the family, and how the family's response has been. I will say that my immediate family has been very receptive, very positive. Nothing that has been, I was apprehensive about that, and that has been a wonderful kind of homecoming, I would say. So that's a happy story. My perception of my own place within family history, that's interesting. I feel like it's unfolding. And I feel like I've documented a little bit of the family history, even though the Clarks are really not blood relatives. We're really, but I guess it feels like, that's a good question. And I don't think I've answered it for myself yet. So I'm not sure. But I feel like I consolidated some things, and I kind of put for myself personally and kind of put them away I hope in a healthy way by writing this.
Yeah.
And feels less, because I was writing about someone who had been erased while I had felt erased at times. So I think having done that feels stabilizing. Yeah.
Good. By way of closing statement, I just quickly address a kind factual question and then make a comment. Savage ended up in Virginia Beach, Virginia, because his daughter, Betsy Main, lived and still lives there. And he thought that she needed his help and this and that, and she became the literary executor, as a matter of fact. So in extreme old age, she forced his hand, and he left his male lover behind in San Francisco and got moved for the less than the last decade of his life to Virginia Beach. It's interesting, the active part of my career. I retired from 40 years of academia just a year and a half or less ago, and I wanted to close it out as far as books that aren't poetry books or essays of my own with this biography. It's interesting always, isn't it? Liz would agree with me, I think, in saying that it's a curious and shifting relationship between biographer and subject. I tried to keep myself mostly out, but that said, I feel deep affinities with my biographical subject, even though I'm not gay. Tom Savage, for example, was a classical music geek. I absolutely have been all my life. Tom Savage loved Bruckner symphonies. I don't have very many friends or anybody I know who loves Bruckner symphonies anywhere the way that I do. Tom Savage liked gin. I love gin. I don't drink it or anything else in the quantity that he drank anything. And I'm certainly not handsome the way that this guy was. By the way, this is the photo of Tom that I got on the cover of the biography. And this is one of my favorite pictures of him. Casually smoking a cigarette through a holder a la FDR in his right hand, and holding a cup. I did talk about in the book as a Jefferson cup. He's got gin and milk in the same little pewter cup in his other hand. He drank way too much. He knew how good he was. And he also said he knew nothing about marketing books. And despite the sorrow and the wreck that in some ways he and his wife wrought in personal family terms, they produced a lot of great work. They both have produced a lot of fiction, and there again is no question in my mind that he's one of the best from Montana in fiction, and he sure as hell should be taught and talked about a lot more than just by this guy here from Gillum.
Well, you've definitely helped pave that path. And I would like to say that when I finished the book and read your bio, I was not surprised to realize that you were also a poet, because it is just so beautifully written.
Oh, thank you for that.
It's a pleasure. I'm excited it's in the world.
So have we exceeded our time now?
No, that was wonderful. Yeah, we've hit the hour mark. An enormous thank you to you both, Liz and Alan, for this really wonderful conversation. I love these books too. Please purchase them at Fact and Fiction. Code
Yay, Fact and Fiction.
Yes, code MBF at checkout, whether you're online at factandfictionbooks.com or whether you're in store here in Missoula. Thank you, audience members, for being here and asking really wonderful questions. And I want to thank our sponsors again, Arts Missoula, MissoulaEvents.net, the Whitefish Review, Humanities Montana, and the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation. And again, just enormous thank you to you both for being here and providing such a wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. It was really fun.
Yeah, it was so nice to meet you.
Really enjoyed it.
Yes. Okay. I hope you have a wonderful evening, everyone, Liz, Alan, audience, and have a great evening.
Okay.
Okay.